I'm Emily, and I'm 27 years old. 6 years ago, my aunt stole the inheritance my dying father left me, over $1 million. I was 21, grieving, broke, and too naive to fight back. She told me the money was gone, smiled in my face, and handed me a check for $7,000 like it was a favor. But she made one mistake: she underestimated the niece. I spent nearly a decade learning the law, chasing her paper trail, and planning her downfall so thoroughly she never even saw it coming. This isn't a revenge story drenched in drama or violence. It's one that creeps in, patient and cold, until it rots everything from the inside. You want to know how I ruined her life? Then listen closely. I remember the way Marla used to look at me, like I was a stranger in my own bloodline. Her smile always stretched too tight when she saw me, eyes flicking past like I was an inconvenience in the way of something more important. Just the niece, she'd say to friends, waiters, lawyers, like my existence needed clarifying. She never said my name unless it was to correct me, and even then, it felt like a dismissal. At family dinners, she'd toast to my father's success and pointedly ignore the fact that I was his only child, his pride. She'd bring gifts for everyone but me, excuse it as forgetfulness, and then laugh when I said nothing. I was young, but not stupid. I felt it, the deliberate exclusion, the passive-aggressive cruelty wrapped in saccharine words. My mother once warned me, quietly, that Marla didn't believe I belonged. She said Marla saw me as a mistake that kept her brother from something better. And the worst part? She made me believe it too. For years, I thought I really was just the niece. Just the afterthought. Just the obstacle. Marla wore her wealth like armor, designer silk blouses, pearls that caught the light, and a perfume so sharp it made your eyes water if you stood too close. She didn't speak loudly, but every word was laced with venom disguised as charm. I remember being 10, sitting quietly on the edge of her pristine leather couch, afraid to touch anything, while she sipped wine and talked over my mother's head as if she were invisible. Marla hated my mom, called her a gold digger once, not knowing I was within earshot. I asked her what that meant. She smiled and said, "Someone who marries above their worth." That was her in a sentence, cruel with a smile. Her compliments felt like slaps. "You've got your mother's nose," she once said, "but don't worry, you can fix that later." She'd pretend to be generous when my dad was around, giving me birthday cards with empty envelopes and promises of gifts that never came. But it wasn't about me, not really. Marla didn't hate me. She hated what I represented, a permanent reminder that my father had chosen a life, a family, a legacy without her. And for a woman like Marla, who measured everything in control and assets, that was the ultimate betrayal. My father was the only shield I had against Marla's poison, and when he got sick, that shield cracked fast. It started with stomach pain he brushed off for weeks, until the tests came back with the word that steals air from your lungs: pancreatic. Stage 4. 6 months, maybe less. I was 20, in college, and I dropped everything to come home. Marla, of course, showed up with her crocodile tears and casseroles no one asked for, lingering in corners like a shadow waiting for the lights to go out. But my dad, he never lost clarity. Even as his body weakened, his mind stayed sharp. One afternoon, when his voice was barely above a whisper, he called me into his study. Everything was laid out, folders, signatures, legal documents, all precise like he was preparing for a final audit. "You'll be taken care of," he told me, sliding a sealed envelope into my hands. "Don't trust anyone blindly. Especially her." He meant Marla. And then came the twist: she'd be the executor. "She won't risk screwing it up," he said, coughing through the words, "not if she thinks I'm still watching her." It was the only mistake he ever made. 3 months later, I watched him die holding my hand. The house felt colder that night. And when I turned and saw Marla at the doorway, arms crossed, eyes dry, I didn't feel comfort. I felt the first chill of betrayal creeping in. The envelope sat on my nightstand for days after the funeral, its edges worn from me picking it up and putting it back down, too afraid to open it and see the future I wasn't ready to claim. When I finally peeled it open, it was like reading the blueprint of my father's love, clear, structured, intentional. The documents outlined everything: a trust fund with my name on it, properties, long-term investments, life insurance policies, even handwritten notes about what to do first. It added up to just under $1.2 million, every cent accounted for. The trust would activate after probate, and while I would have preferred anyone else, my Aunt Marla had been legally named the executor. My father's reasoning echoed in my head: she wouldn't dare risk her own reputation, but the knot in my stomach tightened all the same. I took the papers to her personally, hands trembling, hoping this would be the last time I'd have to rely on her for anything. She smiled, tight-lipped, eyes scanning the pages like a hawk pretending to be disinterested. "Don't worry," she said, folding the documents with care that felt performative. "I'll handle everything." I walked out of her house with that gnawing sensation again, the one that whispered she'd already started figuring out how to make it all hers. It took nearly 9 months for Marla to call me back, her voice as breezy as if she were asking about lunch plans, not my father's legacy. I remember sitting on the edge of my mattress, holding my breath as she told me, without a hint of remorse, that there had been complications. She explained that the estate had been mismanaged prior to my father's death, that some debts had surfaced, and that market losses had eaten up much of the investments. It sounded rehearsed, slick, legal. She said it all with such practiced detachment that I almost missed the punchline. "After clearing what we could, this is what remains." A check slid across her pristine kitchen counter, $7,438. I stared at it like it was a joke, a test, something meant to trigger a reaction. But Marla just sipped her coffee and smiled, as if she'd done me a favor. My heart was thudding in my ears, but I couldn't find my voice. I was 21, grieving, broke, and barely out of school. I didn't know how wills worked. I didn't know how to fight her. And she knew that. She patted my hand on the way out, said something about being grateful for what we're given, and closed the door behind me. That check didn't even cover my father's headstone. And yet somehow, she still made it feel like I owed her. I walked out of Marla's house that day clutching the check like it might somehow grow heavier in my hand, like maybe if I stared at it long enough, it would rewrite itself into the life my father had promised me. But it didn't. It stayed exactly what it was, a final insult printed in ink. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying her words, her calm tone, the way she sipped her coffee like none of it mattered. I wanted to scream, to ask questions, to tear into her lies, but I didn't know where to begin. I was 21, barely making rent, living on cheap noodles and grief. The check went straight to funeral costs and overdue bills, gone within weeks. And then I did what I hate myself for even now. I let it go. I told myself maybe she was right. Maybe things had gone wrong. Maybe the markets had collapsed. She was older, smarter, familiar with these things. I was just the kid left behind. And for a while, that's exactly how I lived, swallowing my anger, avoiding her calls, pretending the betrayal didn't burn at the back of my throat. I let the story she gave me become the one I told myself, until the cracks started to show. The job wasn't glamorous, just a clerk position at a modest law firm downtown, filing documents, refilling toner, and navigating a maze of beige cubicles that smelled like paper and burnt coffee. But it was stable, and after 2 years of floating between temp gigs and unpaid internships, I was desperate for stability. At first, I didn't think much about probate law. I was too focused on getting things alphabetized and avoiding mistakes. But over time, things started to click. I'd hear attorneys casually discussing trusts, disputes, mismanaged estates, and the legal processes that followed. Terms like executor misconduct, forensic accounting, and breach of fiduciary duty began to sound familiar and deeply personal. I started staying late, pretending to reorganize supply closets just to listen in on meetings. One day, I filed a case eerily similar to mine, a daughter contesting her aunt's handling of her father's estate. I read it 3 times, heart pounding, my fingers trembling as I highlighted keywords like asset transfer fraud and civil restitution. That night, I went home, pulled out the dusty manila envelope with my father's plan, and read it like a stranger, not a daughter. For the first time, I wondered, not quietly, but with sharp, rising certainty, what if she lied? What if it was all still there, and she just took it? Once the suspicion took root, it spread fast, like mold in the walls of a house you thought was solid. I started replaying every detail of those months after my father died, the vague delays, the language Marla used, the check that barely paid for his cremation. I remembered her posture, her tone, the way she'd neatly packaged the lie and expected me to accept it like a gift. And I had. But not anymore. I began keeping notes, quiet and methodical, tucked between client files and coffee receipts. I revisited the envelope from my father, reread each clause, and cross-referenced every listed asset with what little public records I could access. Things didn't line up. A property in Colorado my father supposedly sold before his death was still listed under the family trust. A debt repayment Marla claimed had drained the account wasn't reflected anywhere in the probate filings I could find. I hadn't even seen the full probate record. That became the next obsession. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. It felt too fragile, too dangerous, like whispering a truth that might disappear if spoken aloud. But deep in my gut, something had shifted. The ground beneath the story Marla sold me was starting to crumble. And underneath it, I could feel the real truth waiting, ugly, buried, and ready to be unearthed. It took months of subtle digging and careful questions before I finally got what I needed. A paralegal named Jenna, sharp, kind, and quietly rebellious, had noticed my interest in probate cases and, one late afternoon, leaned over and asked, "You looking for something specific?" I hesitated, then nodded. Jenna didn't press. 2 weeks later, she slipped me a flash drive wrapped in a napkin. "You didn't get this from me," she whispered. I took it home with shaking hands. Inside were scanned copies of the full probate filings from my father's estate, documents I had never seen, ones Marla conveniently kept out of my reach. I sat up all night reading them, page after page, and with every clause, every transaction, my stomach twisted tighter. The estate hadn't crumbled. It had been moved, sold, transferred, funneled into shell accounts and LLCs registered in states with lenient disclosure laws. Marla had written checks to herself labeled consulting fees, claimed non-existent renovations on properties, and even listed payments to vendors that didn't exist. And the signatures, they were hers. All of them. No hiding. No proxy. No shame. By the time the sun rose, my heart was pounding, not from grief, but from rage. For the first time in years, I saw it clearly. She hadn't just stolen from me. She'd rewritten my father's legacy to serve herself. And now, I had the proof. By the time I finished reading the last document, my hands were shaking so badly I dropped the flash drive onto the floor. It landed with a soft clink, but the noise felt deafening in the silence of my apartment. I couldn't breathe. My heart was beating like war drums, not from fear, but fury, raw, electric, righteous fury. It wasn't just theft. It was desecration. Marla hadn't only taken what was mine. She'd taken his legacy, the final act of love from a man who planned every detail to protect me, and twisted it into a funnel for her greed. She'd done it knowing I was too young, too broken, too lost to stop her. And worse, she'd smiled while doing it. That check for $7,438 flashed in my memory like a cruel joke, a performance piece for an audience of one, me. I paced the room like a caged thing, fury pulsing through my jaw, my fists, my spine. I wanted to scream, to drive to her house and make her see what she'd done, but I didn't. Not yet. Because even through the rage, something colder settled in, clarity. I knew now. I had the truth, but truth without proof was useless in her world. I needed more. I needed strategy. And most of all, I needed time. Once the rage settled into something sharper, purpose, I started dissecting every transaction, every signature, every legal sleight of hand Marla used to gut the estate. It was like peeling an onion, each layer more rotten than the last. She'd created at least 3 shell companies, one of them registered to a P.O. box in Nevada, a classic move for dodging scrutiny. There were invoices for consulting services totaling over $200,000, all paid to that same shell. Another chunk of the money went to a property in Arizona, purchased by an LLC tied to a burner email and a fake business address that traced back to a strip mall nail salon. She'd buried her tracks under a mountain of forged documentation and strategic jargon, debt reconciliation, asset reallocation, emergency liquidity events. But it wasn't clever, it was just brazen. The arrogance dripped off every page. She never thought anyone would look closely, never thought I would understand enough to connect the dots. But I was learning fast, faster than she could have imagined. And with every transaction I traced, every lie I unspooled, the story she'd told me, the one I swallowed when I was too numb to know better, burned itself out like the last page of a bad script. This wasn't a tragedy anymore. It was becoming a case. The evidence I had was damning, but not complete, and definitely not enough to survive the kind of legal scrutiny Marla could afford to deflect. Every instinct screamed to go to the police, to storm into a courtroom with files in hand and tear down the walls of her lies. But emotion wasn't going to win this. Marla had the money, the network, and the decades of experience navigating systems like a snake through grass. If I moved too early, she'd wriggle out of it. Discredit me. Bury me in red tape and counter lawsuits. I couldn't afford mistakes. So I made a decision, no cops. Not yet. Instead, I began cataloging everything, organizing records, backing up files, timestamping data. I created a timeline, a digital archive, a printed binder. I saved recordings of old voicemails, phone calls, even casual mentions where she'd slipped and referred to assets she claimed were gone. I knew what I needed now: leverage. Something she couldn't wriggle away from. I wasn't just looking to expose her, I wanted to make sure that when she fell, she wouldn't be able to stand again. And for that, I needed to keep digging, and pull in someone who could follow the money deeper than I ever could alone. His name was Theo, an old classmate from the law office who had transitioned into forensic accounting after leaving a messy inheritance dispute of his own. We weren't close, but I remembered the way he talked about numbers like they were evidence in a murder case, and I knew he had a soft spot for people who'd been screwed over. I sent him a message: "I have something big. Need a second brain." We met at a diner 3 towns over. I brought a flash drive and a binder thicker than a law textbook. He barely spoke as he flipped through it, his fingers tracing every forged invoice, every wire transfer, every LLC Marla had touched. Then he looked at me and said, "You've got her. She's just sloppy enough to hang herself if we pull the right thread." Over the next 3 months, Theo became my ghost partner. Nights and weekends, we pored over bank statements and property records, matching timestamps, sourcing fake vendors, and tracking the money flow like blood from a wound. He taught me how to spot the patterns, how to see past the smoke. And together, we built something bigger than just a paper trail. We built a narrative, clean and damning, with evidence strong enough to draw the attention of anyone who mattered. Marla had no idea her fortress was leaking from the inside. But I knew. And now, so did someone who could help me burn it down. Theo called it the wire game, and once he explained it, I couldn't unsee it. Marla hadn't just laundered money, she played a symphony of deception, moving funds through layers of shell companies, converting assets into offshore accounts, then back into real estate and bogus consulting firms. Every time we traced a transfer, there was another layer, a different bank, a new business entity, some registered in Delaware, others masked by privacy laws in the Caymans. She'd turned my father's legacy into a washing machine for her greed, scrubbing the origin until it looked clean to anyone who didn't know where to look. But Theo did. He mapped it out on my living room wall, colored string, notes, flowcharts that turned my apartment into a war room. One wire caught his attention: $84,000 sent to a contractor in Nevada just weeks after my father's funeral. The contractor didn't exist. The account it was sent to? Still active. Still accepting deposits. That was our breach point. From there, we followed the flow backward and forward, linking the transaction to multiple fake invoices and eventually to a property in Marla's name, buried beneath 2 LLCs but unmistakably hers. The final insult? The property had a home theater and marble countertops. She'd built a palace with my inheritance. But now, I had the blueprint. And soon, so would the people who could tear it down. By this point, I didn't trust Marla with a breath of air, but I knew one thing: she loved to gloat when she thought she had the upper hand. So I started calling her again, planting small questions beneath a mask of false politeness, soft, almost meek, like I was still the clueless little girl she'd once conned. Every call was recorded. I bought a cheap burner phone, synced it to an app that logged every conversation, and saved them to both cloud and hard drive. At first, she was guarded, careful with her words, speaking in vague, dismissive tones. But over time, as I peppered her with innocent questions, about my father's stocks, the trust fund, a property in Colorado, her cracks began to show. "That account wasn't supposed to be traceable," she muttered once, not realizing I'd said nothing about any account. Another time, she scoffed, "Your father had no idea how complicated things were behind the scenes," then paused, as if she'd just said too much. But the moment that sealed it was when she laughed, actually laughed, and said, "You think you lost something? Honey, you never had it." That one sentence, spiteful, venom-laced, and oblivious, was all I needed. Her voice. Her words. Her tone. The predator unmasked. I didn't react. I just ended the call, saved the file, and named it, Marla_confession.wave. I knew then, the game was nearly over. It felt like stepping into someone else's skin. I dyed my hair darker, changed my posture, even picked up a different cadence when I spoke. The name on my application was Emily Ward, a combination of my mother's middle name and the street we used to live on when life was still whole. I applied for a temp admin role at the accounting firm Marla had used for years, quietly, subtly, just long enough to slip into the belly of the beast. I knew which branch to target, which partner she used, even which assistant she sweet-talked over holiday wine. And when I got the call, "We'd like you to start Monday," I smiled like it was any other job. Inside, I was ice. For the next few weeks, I became a ghost in the machine. Filing, sorting, scanning, and watching. I paid close attention to every account Marla had touched, quietly misfiling copies into my personal folder, noting inconsistencies, and marking down every offshore wire the firm had cleared with a blind eye. It was all there, names of shell companies I'd already mapped, addresses linked to her fake vendors, transactions dressed up in professional language that would crumble under audit. The best part? I didn't even have to dig too hard. Marla's arrogance had left fingerprints all over the books. And once I flagged them to the right partner, with just enough plausible deniability, they'd be forced to investigate. My job was never to expose her directly. It was to light the match and quietly step back, and now, the fuse was lit. It started with a memo, just a routine internal notice from the firm's compliance officer about discrepancies found during internal review. But I knew what it really was, the first tremor. A week later, hushed meetings began behind glass walls, and Marla's name started popping up in partner emails marked urgent and confidential. The accounting firm, once her fortress, was turning against her. I watched it all unfold from my desk, silent and composed, as executives reviewed flagged transactions that suddenly didn't add up. One of the partners, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Hale, began asking quiet questions. Why was this vendor paid twice? Where's the source contract for this transfer? And then, why is this property linked to a client account that closed 5 years ago? Marla's files were pulled. An audit team was assembled. The partners called for a freeze on any accounts linked to shell entities flagged in the system. From there, the dominoes fell. Fast. The moment the firm suspected they'd been used to launder funds, even unknowingly, they initiated a formal report to the IRS to cover themselves. By the time Marla realized the tide had shifted, it was too late. She called the firm to clear things up, but her usual charm didn't work over panic. Her name was now a liability, not a legacy. And I, the quiet temp named Emily, sat calmly at my desk as the walls she'd built to protect her began to fold like paper in fire. It happened on a Thursday morning, just after 10 a.m., a time when Marla was usually lounging in her sunroom with a mimosa in one hand and her phone in the other, scrolling through social feeds like a queen watching peasants. This time, though, the knock at her door wasn't a delivery. It was the IRS and the state's Financial Crimes Unit, badges out, gloves on, warrants in hand. I didn't see it in person, but I didn't have to. Theo texted me 3 words, they got her. Minutes later, I saw the footage. Someone from the neighborhood caught it on their phone. Marla, in a silk robe and smug confusion, trying to wave the agents off like they were an inconvenience. Then the expression changed, slid from mild annoyance to dawning panic. She started asking questions. What's this about? There must be a mistake. But they weren't listening. They were walking through her foyer with gloves and folders, opening drawers, photographing paperwork, seizing electronics. One officer calmly read off the charges: fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion, forgery. She stood frozen, mimosa trembling in her hand. That image, her in her designer robe, wide-eyed, clutching a glass of citrus and champagne while everything she built came crashing down, that was the moment I'd waited for. She didn't know who had set the fire. And she never saw me coming. The day after the raid, I walked into the courthouse alone, binder in hand, and filed the civil suit myself. No fanfare, no press, just a quiet motion with teeth. I wasn't content with watching her face charges from the state. I wanted my name, my father's name, cleared in court. I wanted the money returned, the damages acknowledged, the betrayal carved into the record like a scar she couldn't hide from. I knew the evidence inside that binder could do it: detailed asset maps, signed documents, recordings, timelines, all neatly organized and impossible to refute. Theo had helped me polish it, and the attorneys I'd consulted off record said it was airtight. Within a week, Marla's attorneys, yes, plural, tried to contact me. First with charm, then concern, and finally with thinly veiled threats. I ignored them all. She wasn't negotiating her way out of this. Not with me. The court accepted the case without hesitation. I listed damages: full restitution of the estate, legal costs, and punitive damages for breach of fiduciary duty. When the official papers were served to her in holding, I imagine her lips curling into that old, fake smile of hers, only this time, there was no one left to fool. For the first time in my life, I had the power. And she had no idea how much she'd taught me about using it. Marla took a plea deal. Of course she did. After months of posturing and legal maneuvering, her high-priced attorneys couldn't erase the evidence, the forged documents, the offshore accounts, the voice recordings, the civil suit stacked on top of the criminal charges. The walls had closed in. She pled guilty to fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement in exchange for a reduced sentence, 6 years in a minimum security prison. But the real punishment wasn't just the prison time, it was everything else. Her house was seized. Her bank accounts frozen. The so-called friends who once sipped champagne in her garden now ghosted her like she was radioactive. Her name was printed in local papers, not as a socialite, but as a thief. I watched the footage of her sentencing, pausing when the camera caught her in cuffs, orange jumpsuit, no makeup, her hair graying at the roots. That once flawless exterior now cracked, unfiltered, real. She looked small. For the first time, truly small. And as the judge read her sentence, she glanced around the courtroom like someone expecting rescue. No one came. Not a soul. I didn't go. I didn't need to. Because I'd already seen what I came for, the fall. And watching her sit behind that defense table in prison orange, clutching nothing but regret. It suited her better than pearls ever did. The first letter came exactly 2 weeks after her sentencing, thick cream-colored envelope with slanted cursive that used to mean elegance, but now just reeked of desperation. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I knew what it would say. Excuses, rationalizations, maybe even a half-hearted apology that still blamed my grief, my youth, my lack of understanding. Over the next few months, more followed, each one unopened, stacked in a drawer I no longer bothered locking. Some came around holidays. One even arrived on what would have been my father's birthday, and that one almost broke me. But I reminded myself, she was not reaching out from love. She was reaching out because no one else would answer. In prison, stripped of everything she used to hide behind, Marla had nothing left but memories. And I had denied her the comfort of rewriting them. Theo once asked me why I didn't at least read one, just to know. I told him the truth. Because silence is the only answer she ever gave me that was honest. Let her write. Let her wonder. I moved on without her voice in my ear, and that's exactly what she deserved. It arrived on a Monday, folded into a plain white envelope like it was just another piece of mail. No fanfare. No weight to match its meaning. But when I opened it and saw the numbers, $1,204,581.37, my hands went still. It was the final payment, the full restitution awarded by the court, down to the penny my father had planned for me to inherit. It had taken nearly a decade, sleepless nights, countless hours of research, and the slow, surgical unraveling of a woman who thought she was too clever to ever be caught. And yet here it was, justice, not as a blaze of glory, but as quiet, undeniable math. I sat on the back porch with a glass of scotch, his favorite, and stared into the sky until it turned gold. I didn't cry. I didn't cheer. I just felt, complete. My father's voice echoed somewhere in the wind, that familiar calm, plan everything, trust no one, and never forget who you are. I hadn't. And now, after everything, the inheritance wasn't just money. It was a memory restored, a lie unraveled, and a promise kept. I had brought her down one document at a time. And this check was the final period at the end of her sentence. The house sat in the Arizona sun like a monument to stolen dreams, sleek, modern, and soulless. It was the property Theo and I had traced through 2 LLCs, purchased with my inheritance and buried beneath layers of fake ownership. Through the asset recovery process, it had been repossessed by the court and awarded to me as part of the civil judgment. I drove there alone one weekend, curious more than anything, and stood in the marble foyer where Marla once bragged about her investment portfolio. The irony wasn't lost on me. Her voice still lingered in the architectural choices, overdone, impersonal, expensive for the sake of appearing untouchable. The home theater, the wine cellar, the cascading glass staircase, it all felt like a mask she'd built to convince the world she was powerful, invincible. And now it belonged to the girl she called just the niece. I didn't keep it. I walked through every room once, taking quiet inventory of what she'd stolen and what I'd taken back. Then I contacted a realtor and listed it for sale, every dollar to be converted into something I chose for myself, not a relic of her delusion. Marla built that house with lies. I walked away from it with truth. For most of my life, I was the quiet one, the polite niece, the grieving daughter, the girl too young and too overwhelmed to speak up when it mattered most. I let people talk over me, down to me, around me. Marla had counted on that. She built her entire betrayal on the assumption that I would stay small. But standing in that house she once ruled, I realized I hadn't just taken back what was stolen, I had become someone else in the process. Someone sharper. louder, strategic. I remembered the first time I walked into a courtroom alone, how my hands trembled until I opened my binder and saw her signature on a falsified document. That's when the fear stopped. That girl who once sat outside Marla's office, waiting for updates that would never come, doesn't exist anymore. In her place stands a woman who fought silently, precisely, and without mercy. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to threaten. I just needed to know how the system worked, and how to use it better than she ever did. Revenge didn't turn me into someone darker. It revealed who I always was, beneath the grief and silence, someone Marla never saw coming. We met at the same diner where it all started, sitting across from each other in a booth stained with memories and cheap coffee. Theo stirred his cup with the same slow rhythm he always did, watching me with that steady gaze that had once read spreadsheets like crime scenes. So, he said finally, was it worth it? The question hit harder than I expected. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because it forced me to hold every moment of the past 9 years at once, my father's quiet voice, Marla's smug smile, the lies, the legal filings, the nights I couldn't sleep because I was learning how to be ruthless without becoming cruel. I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window, where the sun hit the pavement just right, warming the glass like an old promise kept. It wasn't about worth, I said eventually. It was about rightness. Theo nodded once, and that was enough. He didn't need more. Neither did I. There was no victory dance, no parade. Just two people sitting in a booth, sharing silence that finally felt earned. And in that stillness, I realized something else. Revenge had ended. What came next was mine to define. The office was small, 2 rooms, 2nd floor, no elevator, but it was mine. I signed the lease with a hand that didn't shake and ordered a simple brass plaque for the frosted glass door, Ward and Company, Estate and Trust Services. I chose the name carefully. Ward, from my alias, the name I wore when I took back what was mine. It felt poetic. The and Company? That was for the people like Theo, the paralegal who once handed me a file in secret, and everyone else who helped me carry the weight when I wasn't strong enough alone. I wasn't trying to become rich. I wasn't interested in clients with yachts and legacy wars. I wanted the people like me, the daughters and sons who sat in 2 quiet kitchens holding envelopes filled with lies, unsure what came next. My first client was a woman who thought her sister had forged their mother's will. I listened to her story, offered her coffee, and told her something no one told me when I was 21, you're not crazy. And you're not alone. When she left, I turned the lock on the door and sat at my desk for the first time. No Marla. No manipulation. Just my name. My choice. My rules. And finally, my life. It was 2 years into Marla's sentence when I finally said yes to the visit, not out of curiosity, not out of sympathy, but because closure sometimes asks for confrontation. The prison was colder than I expected, beige and metallic, humming with fluorescent lights and the weight of wasted time. She walked into the visitation room wearing the standard orange jumpsuit, her once pristine hair now dull and shoulder-length, face lined not with age but with defeat. When she saw me, something flickered behind her eyes, shame, maybe, or fear disguised as indignation. You look different, she said, and I smiled. I am. She tried to talk about family, about misunderstandings, but I didn't let her control the narrative. I told her what I'd built. I told her the truth about everything she tried to destroy and how, in the end, she was the one left hollow. I didn't go to gloat. I went to end it. She asked if I hated her. I looked her in the eye and said, no. That would mean you still matter. The silence that followed was the deepest I'd ever heard from her. I stood up, thanked her, for the lesson, the fuel, the fire, and walked out. I never went back. I didn't need to. For a long time, I thought my inheritance was just numbers on a page, stocks, property, money siphoned and stolen. But as the years passed, I realized my father had left me something far more enduring. It was in the way he'd labeled every file so I wouldn't be lost, the way he trusted me with the truth even when it hurt, the way he looked at me like I was capable of anything, even rebuilding from ruin. He didn't just leave me assets. He left me a blueprint. A moral compass. A quiet kind of strength that didn't need to shout to be heard. I saw it every day in the clients who walked into my office, in the way I handled their stories with care instead of cynicism. I saw it in the mirror, too, in the steadiness of my own gaze. What I inherited wasn't something Marla could ever touch. It was never hers to corrupt. My father taught me how to think, how to fight with precision, and how to protect what mattered, not just for me, but for others. And that was a legacy worth more than $1 million. It was a different kind of inheritance. One I carried not in my hands, but in my spine. Some evenings, when the air is still and the sky holds that low hum of coming dusk, I sit on my back porch with a glass of scotch and let the wind speak. That was his drink, always neat, always slow. I sip it the way he did, not for the burn, but for the memory. And sometimes, just sometimes, I can almost hear him there beside me, not in words, but in feeling. The same steady presence that filled a room without ever demanding it. He was never the loudest man, but he left the deepest echo. When I look at the files I now keep organized in cabinets, color-coded and secure, I think of the binders he once trusted me with. When I help someone who's just lost everything find the first thread back to truth, I remember how he never let me doubt my place, even when others tried to erase it. His handwriting is still pressed into the pages of my life, invisible but indelible. And though he's gone, the wind remembers him. The trees bend a little when I speak his name. I think the world holds on to people like him in subtle ways. And so do I. She used to call me just the niece, a phrase that hung like dust in every room she walked through, a dismissal wrapped in condescension. It was how she justified what she did, how she convinced herself I wouldn't notice, wouldn't fight, wouldn't win. But what she never understood is that titles don't define power. Actions do. I was the niece, yes. But I was also the daughter of a man who built his life on discipline, honor, and quiet brilliance. I was the girl who sat in silence and watched, who learned, who planned. I was the woman who brought her down one signature, one file, one truth at a time. And now, when people say my name, they don't say it like a footnote, they say it with respect. The story didn't end with what she took. It ended with what I reclaimed. My father's legacy. My voice. My future. I was never just anything. I was always enough. More than enough. And I made sure the world remembered it.